it's not entirely my fault that I'm the way I am. I mean, you try growing up with a professional speaker and statistician as a mom and tell me how your childhood is like everyone else's. I remember growing up, I very intentionally had to make sure that if I wanted something from my parents, even if it was as small as a second helping of mashed potatoes, I had to make sure that I had prepared well and that I was able to coolly and confidently present my arguments as to why exactly I needed whatever it was. 9 times out of 10, I never actually changed my parents' opinion because they were never actually disinclined toward whatever it was. No, instead, I would get whatever it was because I made a compelling case, and that's all they wanted, was to know that I had the ability to do that. And if it was something really important, I learned very early on to quietly go to Dad and leave Mom out of it. One of the lessons that my mom taught me, and one I'll never forget, is the truth that words, numbers, and data, it can all be manipulated to say basically whatever you want it to say. Every time I would bring a case to my parents about why I needed this new toy, or later on it was this new electronic, or why I was ready for my own car, I would need to make sure that I didn't use any data that could easily be flipped and used against me. I remember the time that I tried to convince my parents that I needed a Nintendo 64. I went up to them and I said, Jimmy's parents just got him an N64, and that makes 8 of my friends who have one, and I'm still playing an NES that smokes halfway through the credits. And I can hear my mom say, yeah, but Jimmy's parents both work for the bank and have more money than we do. And besides, of the 24 people who came to your birthday party last year, half of them don't have any Nintendo system at all, so it sounds like you're still ahead, aren't you? When I finally did convince them that I was able to and should get this N64, the only reason that it happened was because I had the money to do so, which, in retrospect, might have been what Mom was going for in the first place. Statistical data, though, especially the way that Kid Wes used it, it can easily be manipulated and flipped to say something that no one really meant it to say in the first place. Now, this does not mean that there's no such thing as quality quantitative research. The academic and professional worlds are replete with example after example of researchers doing just this, doing the work to ensure that their data is complete and as variable-free as possible. Using the scientific method and leaning on others for peer review support, they're able to produce compelling results that honestly must be taken seriously, that are used to enhance our understanding of the world around us. I don't think Mom would say that we have to always be worried that they're flipping and twisting data, but I do think she would say, in fact I know she would say this because she's the one that taught it to me, that when we engage with quantitative data, we should do so with what Paul Ricoeur calls a hermeneutic of suspicion. This idea that we need to interpret everything with the understanding that it may not actually be saying what we think it's saying or what others are telling us it says. In a post-pandemic world where we have experienced what it's like to be bombarded from all sides with words like trust science, but also do your own research, developing a healthy hermeneutic of suspicion can honestly be our saving grace. This is more than simply taking a researcher's word as gospel truth. But it's also not going so far as to think that the average layperson can replicate and enhance the work that went into drawing educated and peer-reviewed conclusions. A proper hermeneutic of suspicion asks questions like, what else could this data be saying that I'm not hearing? What are other ways that the survey questions could have been interpreted that might change the resulting data? What other conclusions might have been drawn from the same research? What variables might not have been taken into account, and what voices need to be part of this conversation that are not at this moment? This approach to research and quantitative data does not guarantee that you'll always come to the correct conclusions. And it doesn't mean you'll always end up disagreeing with the original research study. Instead, a healthy hermeneutic of suspicion allows individuals and groups to lean into curiosity while recognizing and respecting the work that others have already poured into the process. As a great coach and manager from AFC Richmond once said, "Be curious, not judgmental." Engaging the world with a hermeneutic of suspicion allows us to do just that. We're going to give 5 examples from leadership studies and the conclusions drawn from them on how you can engage with a hermeneutic of suspicion. The first comes from the effects of authentic leadership on athlete outcomes, an experimental study. Malloy, Cavasanu, and Mackman seek to examine the effects of authentic leadership on athletes' trust, enjoyment, commitment, and a range of morally relevant variables. They surveyed 129 sports science student athletes from a specific British university. Their method was to put before them 3 different scripts. One where there was a coach with a high, I forgot the word for a moment, authentic leadership score. One where the coach had a very low authentic leadership score, and one that was kind of in the middle, a control script, if you would. And then the student athletes were asked to, using a scale of 1 to 5, rate their comfort and their engagement with each of the coaches. Our researchers had 2 different hypotheses. One, that participants in the high authentic leadership condition would comparatively anticipate feeling greater trust and enjoyment, be more committed to play for the described coach, be less likely to cheat and be aggressive, and anticipate feeling more guilt for cheating and aggression. That's the first hypothesis. The second is basically the flip. The opposite effect would be true for the low authentic leadership condition. Our researchers concluded from their data that hypothesis 1 was only half supported, showing that the authentic leader condition expected greater levels of trust and enjoyment and commitment, but it didn't really show any significant data on its effect on cheating or aggression or the guilt associated with either of those. Concurrently, the second hypothesis was also proven true with that same caveat, that for the low authentic leader score condition, they expected to feel less trust, less excitement, less enjoyment and commitment, but there was not much evidence on how it affected cheating, aggression, or the guilt connected to it. Now, the hermeneutic of suspicion that comes in here with me as I read this study is they didn't talk much about how the high authentic leader condition compared with the control condition. It was only high versus low. What's interesting if you look at the data is there's not much of a difference between high authentic leadership and that mid or control condition. There was a difference between high and low, but not that middle. And so if we look at that first hypothesis that says that they feel more excitement, more trust, more commitment, the data doesn't necessarily say that. Now, these researchers did include a section that we'll see in a few of these different studies that I think is really important. They had a section on the study limitations and future research directions, so that they admitted that there were gaps in what they did, and there were gaps in the data that they collected. And so they have set up future research endeavors for success by kind of starting to pave the way toward where they see some fruitfulness in the next study and how this could be taken further. The next study that we're going to look at is called The Rebellion Under Exploitation: How and When Exploitative Leadership Evokes Employees' Workplace Deviance. In this one, Liu, Wu, Yi, Quan, and Chin seek to show that under leader exploitation, employees engage in organizational and interpersonal deviance. They want to study how this is a mediating influence on moral justification, and they wanted to find who's impacted the most from this type of toxic system. To do this, they surveyed workers from 2 different companies in China, a logistics company and a hotel. Of the 329 of the original 550 surveyed completed the 3 survey questionnaires, each spaced 2 months apart. Those surveyed answered questions on a sliding scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. They wanted to test the hypotheses that exploitative leadership is positively related to employees' organizational deviance, that exploitative leadership is positively related to employees' interpersonal deviance, that moral justification mediates the association between exploitative leadership and organizational and interpersonal deviance, that hostile attribution bias moderates the association between exploitative leadership and moral justification, such as the association is stronger for those with high levels of hostile attribution bias, and that hostile attribution bias moderates through the indirect effect of exploitative leadership in organizational deviance through moral justification, and that the indirect effect is stronger in employees with high hostile attribution bias as well. The research found a significant correlation between exploitative leadership and employee deviance. It found a significant correlation between moral justification and employee deviance. It found exploitative leadership and hostile attribution bias was significantly linked to moral justification, and that the conditional influence of exploitative leadership on employee deviance via moral justification was significant among those with high hostile attribution bias, meaning that all the hypotheses were supported by the data research. Now, this seems great, and it seems like everything folds up nice and neatly into a perfect package. And while the above data shows clear linkages between exploitative leadership and deviance and corruption in employees, the scope of this project has very specific drawbacks. Now, our researchers did a wonderful job of naming the 3 biggest of these drawbacks in their limitations in future research section. They pointed out that this study does not utilize a longitudinal study that could decrease the bias of those surveyed. It doesn't name and address other toxic leadership categories that could be at play in evoking employee deviance. And it doesn't engage a global population that might allow it to remove some of the cultural biases that are present in these Chinese workers specifically. They name, and I think it's important to point out, that this study is not meant to be the final period at the end of the conversation. Instead, it's supposed to be a conjunction, a comma. It's supposed to allow for continuation in what is said and what is done. The third study is the role of organizational justice in linking leadership styles and academics' performance in higher education. In this one, Khan, Gan, Khan, and Saif seek to examine the association between transformational and transactional leadership styles, organizational justice as mediator, and academics' performance in universities and colleges. They used inferential methodology to draw correlative conclusions based on their sample survey, in which employees rated their bosses by answering different questions on a sliding scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. Their sample size was 285 academicians from 2 Pakistani universities. The hypotheses that they were trying to prove or disprove were that significant associations exist between transformational and transactional leadership styles, organizational justice as mediator, and academics' performance. That organizational justice serves as the mediator between transformational leadership and academics' performance, and that organizational justice serves as the mediator as well between transactional leadership and academics' performance. Our researchers found a higher correlation between transformational leadership and academics' performance than with transactional leadership and academics' performance, and found that organizational justice served as at least a partial mediator for both leadership styles. Since a correlation was determined with both styles, all 3 of the hypotheses were supported, at least partially, in this study. More importantly, for continued research, the results show a clear trend toward transformational leadership. Now, I bring the hermeneutic of suspicion into this one because while our researchers' work here seems fairly straightforward and their data drives the results well, their conclusions are a bit of a stretch. After surveying 285 Pakistani academics, both professors and their department heads, their bosses, they reached the conclusion that transformational leadership is both desired by and crucial for the academic leaders throughout developing countries. They go so far as to state that, and I quote, higher institutions are required to implement the transformational style of leadership in letter and spirit to attain the desired outcomes from academics. Their lack of limitations of research section also shows something to be desired by the reader. The fourth study we're going to look at is serving while being energized or strained, a dual path model linking servant leadership to leaders' psychological strain and job performance. In this one, Li, Chin, Bai, Liden, Wang, and Chow work to develop a dual path model that helps to identify the psychological benefits and the strains of servant leadership and identify the proper boundary conditions that lead to healthy servant leadership. They use the longitudinal method, sending out 5 assessments in 1-month intervals to team leads, team followers, and team bosses of a large Chinese manufacturing company. They received all 5 assessments back from 474 team leads, 3,712 team followers, and 97 team bosses. They sought to answer the following hypotheses. Servant leadership is positively related to leader satisfaction. Leader need satisfaction mediates servant leadership's negative relationship to leader psychological strain and its positive relationship to leader job performance. Servant leadership is positively related to leader role conflict. Leader role conflict mediates servant leadership's positive relationship to leader psychological strain and its negative relationship to leader job performance. Leader-leader exchange strengthens the positive relationship between servant leadership and leader need satisfaction, whereas leader-leader exchange weakens the positive relationship between servant leadership and leader role conflict. Leader-leader exchange strengthens the negative indirect relationship between servant leadership and leader psychological strain through leader need satisfaction. Leader-leader exchange strengthens the positive indirect relationship between servant leadership and leader job performance through leader need satisfaction. And finally, leader-leader exchange weakens the positive indirect relationship between servant leadership and leader psychological strain through leader role conflict. And it also weakens the negative indirect relationship between servant leadership and leader job performance through leader role conflict. The researchers found that the servant leadership was positively related to leader need satisfaction and leader need was negatively related to leader psychological strain, but there wasn't significant data on leader job performance. This supports the 1A and 1B of the hypothesis, but not necessarily 1C. Interestingly, this is the only study of the 5 where an entire multi-pronged hypothesis point was not supported by the data. Counter to hypothesis 2, points A through C, the data showed no relation between servant leadership, leader role conflict, and the indirect effects of servant leadership on psychological strain or leader job performance. The leader-leader exchange strengthened the positive relationship between servant leadership and leader need satisfaction, so the 4th hypothesis was proven correct. And then leader-leader exchange strengthened the negative indirect relationship between servant leadership and leader psychological strain, and there was no significant evidence to support leader-leader exchange strengthening the positive indirect relationship. So whereas hypothesis 4 was supported, 4A was supported, 4B was not. The data did not show significant indirect relationships between servant leadership and leader psychological strain or leader job performance as moderated by leader-leader exchange. So there was no support for the 5th one as well. Now the hermeneutic of suspicion here comes in that the research, while extensive and targeting questions it seeks to answer, there are unsupported parts of the multi-point hypothesis that need to be covered and need to be addressed. The longitudinal method has given researchers more than enough data to comb through, and they have started a good work there, but I think in reading this and looking at all of the data they have, that there's more to pull from it. And this work could even still, this long after it was originally published, it could still unearth more useful information. Now, they did include a limitations and research directions that also shows that they are well aware of the gaps in their research, and they establish a trailhead for those who come next with both the data they've collected and setting the stage for what happens next. The fifth study that we're going to look at, and the last one, is linking servant leadership to follower emotional exhaustion through impression management. In this, Ping, Gao, and Wang seek to learn about follower well-being as the primary outcome of leadership behaviors and communicate how this research can be used by organizations to benefit the training and development of servant leaders within their organizations. They did this by conducting 2 3-wave studies. The first, which focused only on the first of their 2 hypotheses, was done at a large regional bank in China, where 197 workers completed 3 surveys 6 weeks apart. Unhappy with the results and worried that the data of this first study were skewed because it was biased on homogeneity of the participants, the researchers replicated the study in the United States with a larger and more diverse sample population and with only 1 week in between the surveys instead of 6. The second study covered all 4 of the hypotheses, surveying 377 full-time employees within the USA. Their hypotheses were that servant leadership will be positively related to exemplification, ingratiation, and self-promotion. The servant leadership will have a positive and indirect relationship with employee emotional exhaustion. The positive associations of servant leadership with exemplification, ingratiation, and self-promotion will be accentuated by POP, or perceptions of organizational politics. And then finally, that the indirect and positive relationship between servant leadership and emotional exhaustion will be strengthened by that perceptions of organizational politics. The research results discovered that servant leadership was positively related to exemplification, ingratiation, and self-promotion, which means that the first hypothesis was fully supported. The second hypothesis was that servant leadership's indirect relationship with emotional exhaustion mediated through these 3 areas would be supported. And what the results found was that emotional exhaustion was mediated through exemplification and ingratiation, but there wasn't significant data to to support self-promotion in this. So for the second hypotheses, 2A and 2B were supported, but 2C was not. The interaction between servant leadership and POP, or the perceptions of organizational politics, was significant in accentuating all 3 variables, so hypothesis 3 was supported. And then the indirect and positive relationship between servant leadership and emotional exhaustion was strengthened by POP through the effects on these first 2 areas, exemplification and ingratiation, but not through self-promotion. So like that first one, hypothesis 4A and 4B were supported, but not 4C. The hermeneutical suspicion here is, honestly, I wasn't too impressed with this survey. I was thrown off by the fact that they started in one area, realized that they didn't like the data that they were collecting, so they decided to take it somewhere else and do it bigger and better. I think that shows that there's good character here, that they recognize something, but I also want to know how that data changed, and I want to see the difference in what happened in China versus what happened in the United States of America. Also, in that second study, they did something very interesting with the data that I am not entirely sure about. They had 377 participants fill out the first 2 surveys, but only 302 participants fill out that third survey. They ended up using all 377, knowing that 75 of them were not going to have that third survey at all filled out. What they did was they put a different weight on those 75 surveys compared to the other 302, but they still used them all. And I want to know exactly how that skewed the data, if it did, and how it would have been different if they only took that 302. For me, it sounds like they, to reach the capacity that they wanted, decided to compromise on the research and the data that they were bringing in. Now, I will say that I was glad that they did have a limitations and future research section, and that they lifted up that sample size and cultural differences between studies 1 and 2 are important in recognizing the limitations of all of this. So those are the 5 studies that covered and that I tried to bring some hermeneutical suspicion into. Stephen Amnell's Oliver Queen in the CW show Arrow repopularized a Russian saying that you might have heard Ronald Reagan once say, that we need to trust but verify. This is precisely what we do when we correctly engage in research and study. Quantitative data-driven research is extremely important and should be appreciated for everything that was put into the work. More brilliant minds than my own have given of themselves to pore over vast amounts of information in order to distill it down into something that's palatable for me, and I'm grateful for that. Also, numbers and data can be manipulated to say almost anything we want them to say. A healthy hermeneutic of suspicion helps us to keep this in mind, allowing us to better digest and utilize that information. And, if we're lucky and well enough prepared, it may just land us a snazzy new Nintendo 64.